Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to my channel. If you guys are new here, my name is Crystal and welcome to my channel. If you guys are not already subscribed, then please go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. If you guys are not already aware, I have my true crime series uploaded onto my YouTube channel every Wednesday. I also have the audio version uploaded on Apple Podcast as well every Wednesday also. So if you're listening to this on my Apple Podcast and you'd like to watch the YouTube version, then that link will be down in the description. With that being said, as you guys can see by the title of today's video, we'll be talking about the solved murder of Latrese Curtis. Latrice was a 21-year-old woman who was found on the side of a highway on January 30th, 2008 in Raleigh, North Carolina. Latrice was a college student and a newlywed. On January 29th, after calling her husband after class, Latrice unfortunately never made it home. After dating for only a few months, Latrice and her husband got married on April 27th, 2007. In early of 2008, Latrice and her new husband, Darren, were living in Raleigh, North Carolina. After attending previous colleges, Latrice ended up at the University of North Carolina Central, where she majored in accounting while also working part-time at Sears. It was basically like a huge department store, kind of similar to Macy's. Latrice was described by her friends and family as being loving, happy, very encouraging, and everyone said that every time you saw Latrice, she always seemed to have a smile on her face, and she just was such a joy to be around. Latrice met Darren when she was only 20 years old, which is pretty young to meet someone and then decide that you want to get married to them a few months later. I mean, this was in 2007, so I guess it'd probably be a little bit different if this was in the 1900s because that's kind of how people did things. But being that this was in the 2000s and times were starting to change, people thought that Latrice may have gotten married just a little bit too soon. And even though most people said that, it was apparent that Latrice loved Darren and she wanted to be with him, they just think that she wasn't fully ready for that type of commitment to be like in a full-blown marriage at the age of 21. Latrice was actually still in college. She was still finding herself. She was still pursuing her degree and figuring out, what she wanted to do and what she wanted to become in life. Unfortunately, the details of her life prior to her passing are either unknown or just not confirmed. So let's just start off by talking about what we do know, because like I've said before, I don't want to give you guys misinformation or facts that have not been confirmed. So let's just start off with what we do know for sure about Latrice. So although Latrice and Darren were married in April of 2007, Latrice was actually seeing another man. Details as to when Latrice started seeing another man are actually unclear. We're not sure if she started seeing this man before her and Darren got married or if this affair began after her and Darren were married. But this man was someone who Latrice indeed was having a sexual relationship with, and it was continued throughout 2007. The man that Latrice was having an affair with, his name was Stephen, and he was also a student attending the University of North Carolina Central, taking classes alongside Latrice. So I guess one would assume that this is where Latrice and Stephen met. But again, that information is unconfirmed. But being that they attended the same college, it's highly likely that they could have met there. So Stephen was a basketball player at the university, and from what many people say, he had a reputation on campus for, dating a lot of women and kind of sort of like being a player. Stephen has said that he did know that Latrice was married, but that she told him she was separated at the time. But then again, Stephen also had a girlfriend while this affair was going on. So even if Stephen did or didn't know about Latrice being married, he himself was in a committed relationship. And a lot of people assumed that because of this affair, Latrice was having early marital issues in her marriage. But what we do know is that she was a very young woman and she probably started to feel like others were feeling, that she had gotten married too soon. So during the time that Latrice was having an affair with Stephen, Stephen was actually living in a basement apartment that he was renting from a local minister. So when Stephen and Latrice would get together and, do their thing, it would be at Stephen's place, which was this basement, that he was renting. So the night of January 29th, 2009, Latrice went to Stephen's house after she had gotten out of class, and they then met up and had sex. She then left, got in her car, and headed home. On her way home, she made a phone call to her husband, Darren, around 10 p.m. So when she called her husband, she told him that either she had just gotten out of class or she had just gotten done studying. Either way, Darren assumed that Latrice was on her way home from the college that night. After Latrice left Stephen's house, Stephen then decided he was going to go to his girlfriend's house. So shortly after Latrice left and went back home, Stephen left his home as well and went to go spend some time with his girlfriend. Stephen has stated later on that night, after Latrice left his house, Latrice gave Stephen a call, and she basically kind of told him like, hey, I'm really feeling you. I kind of want things to, go a bit further. Like, I want to take the next step in our relationship, which again, we don't know if Stephen knew if Latrice was married at the time, but Latrice knew that she was married at the time. So one would think what she kind of meant by this to Stephen. But we don't want to harp on that statement too much. But what we do know is that after she left his house, she ended up calling him, stating she wanted more out of their relationship, basically. So Stephen continued to just chill and hang out at his girlfriend's house up until about 1 a.m. Then he headed back home. But unfortunately, Latrice did not make it back to her apartment that night that she shared with her husband, Darren. Darren started to get worried, and his first thoughts were that maybe Latrice had gone back to her parents' house and just ended up spending the night there. But by the next morning, on January 30th, 2009, Latrice still was not answering her phone, and she still wasn't home. So around 8 a.m. that morning, Darren called 911 to report Latrice missing. He stated, and I quote, "I talked to her Tuesday night while she was on her way home from school. She was in the car and everything and hasn't showed up since," end quote. This information was unknown to Darren, but shortly before he called 911 to report his wife missing, local police were actually receiving a lot of calls about a body being found lying on the side of the road on the I-540 highway. When police and investigators arrived to the scene, they knew that the victim was deceased upon arrival and that they had been brutally stabbed to death. In addition to the body, officers also found a white Nissan Sentra not too far from the body. Shortly after Darren called 911, he proceeded to get into his car on his own, and he began driving basically like the same route that Latrice would have taken home from school the previous night. And sure enough, Darren sees a huge, scene going on with bunch of police cars, investigator cars, caution tape. He sees like a whole area basically blocked off on the side of the highway. Before jumping to conclusions, Darren stated that he tried to first figure out who his wife's last contact was, basically to see if they had knew anything about Latrice's whereabouts. So he's on the I-540, he sees this scene, but I don't think he spots Latrice's car right away, but he sees this scene, and I'm pretty sure he proceeds to just go back home and say, okay, let me backtrack Latrice's steps, which is why he then looked up to see who the last number Latrice contacted was. So when Darren got home, he was actually able to access Latrice's phone log, and he had noticed that Latrice made multiple calls to a number the previous night. Darren then called the number, and Stephen answered the phone. Darren introduced himself. He said, "Hi, I'm Latrice's husband. Have you heard from her? Have you seen her? She didn't come home last night." And, he said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. I don't know where she is, but if you do hear something, can you please let me know? Because, I'd like to know that she's okay." Darren's like, "Yeah, whatever." He hangs up the phone. So after this phone call, something in Darren's gut told him to go back to where that crime scene was that he had saw while he was driving on the I-540 freeway. So Darren decided to go back to the scene, and when he did, he realized that a car was pulled over not too far from where investigators were, and he noticed that that was the same exact car that his wife drove. He pulled over, he walked up to investigators, he showed them a picture of Latrice on his phone and said, "Is this the woman? Is this the woman that's over there? This is my wife." And authorities then tell him, like, "Yes, I'm so sorry. Unfortunately, this is your wife and she is deceased." Darren stated, and I quote, "I showed them a picture and said, 'This is my wife, and that is her car up there. Please tell me that's not her under that tarp,'" end quote. Later on that morning, Latrice's story made the news, but they did not identify who the young female was that they found. So while this news story is getting aired, Latrice's father actually had happened to been watching the news that morning and, was like, "Oh my God, like, that's so sad. A woman was just found on the side of the highway." But while he's watching this story and feeling these emotions, he has no idea that the woman found was his daughter. A few hours later, Latrice's parents did receive that unfortunate fateful call stating that their daughter had been murdered. So later on in the morning, around 11 a.m., officers brought Darren into the police station to answer some questions, about the night before. Darren told them that he had been home the entire night. He provided DNA samples, and he also willingly took a lie detector test. Darren was very cooperative. The officer stated that he even allowed them to search his vehicle and his apartment that he shared with Latrice. So I think this is when investigators most likely got like their biggest break in the case. A state trooper reported that earlier in the morning at 1:30 a.m. on January 20th, 2008, which was hours before Latrice's body was found, the trooper stated that he was driving down the highway and he saw a vehicle near where Latrice's body was found. He didn't see her body, but he did see the vehicle with hazard lights on. The driver's side window was rolled down. The doors were locked and the keys were in the ignition. The trooper stated that he then noticed another vehicle, which was later identified to be Latrice's vehicle, directly across from the vehicle that he saw on the highway, and that vehicle's hazard lights were on as well. This trooper stated that he then decided to run the plates on the first vehicle he spotted and discovered that that vehicle was registered to a man named Robert Reeves. When Robert's name was brought up, the detectives nor Latrice's family had ever heard of this Robert Reed, which led them to think that, okay, just because Latrice's car was, on the opposite side of the highway doesn't really mean that this guy's vehicle being pulled over has anything to do with Latrice's vehicle, which is what the family and the officers are assuming. However, detectives decided not to just give this Robert Reeves name up yet. They continued to investigate and look into this Robert Reeves, and they sure enough discovered a really interesting connection. Reeves was actually a local minister at a church in Durham, North Carolina. But another thing officers discovered was that Robert Reeves shared the same home address as Latrice's lover, Stephen. So now investigators are just trying to figure out how these two men, Stephen and Robert Reeves, could possibly have something to do with the death of Latrice. After doing some more investigative work and digging, officers were able to start to put the pieces together about this story and were able to locate the last person that Latrice spoke to. They then discovered that this person was Stephen, which now for the officers connected the dots from Robert Reeves to Stephen to Latrice. So now officers needed to speak to Robert Reeves and Stephen, try to figure out how either of them were connected to Latrice's murder, if either of them knew anything about Latrice's murder. They just knew that they needed to speak to Robert and Stephen ASAP. So here we are now, 2 days later after Latrice's body is found. It is February 1st, 2008. Reeves and Stephen went to the police station to be questioned by authorities. The very first thing that police noticed was that Robert had a cut on his hand and scratches all over his legs that appeared to be fresh scratches. So when Robert was questioned, as to where he got these cuts and scratches from, obviously police are going to ask him, where did you get these scratches from? His response was that he got them while he was moving a desk. But these claims were later disputed by Stephen because Stephen actually stated that he had helped Robert move the desk a few days prior, and while moving it, Robert didn't get any scratches, cuts, bruises, abrasions, anything. So basically, Stephen just debunked Robert's whole, theory that he stated as to him getting all these cuts and bruises. Once police kind of told Robert, like, hey, Stephen told us that's not how you got these cuts and bruises. Where did you really get these from? This is when Robert kind of started to point all the fingers at Stephen. He stated that he knew Stephen was having a sexual relationship with Latrice. He even stated that he knew for a fact that Stephen and Latrice had sex on January 29th. And he also stated that he knew that that very night after she left his house, she told Stephen that she wanted to take their relationship to the next level. Robert also told police that Stephen received a phone call from Latrice in the early morning hours on January 29th, and that Stephen had a collection of knives in his room. Robert also was saying that Stephen had kept a gun underneath his pillow. So at this point, the gates have just opened. Once the police were like, hey, Robert, we know you're lying about the cuts and scratches. What really went down? He started thinking about any and everything he could say about Stephen, basically trying to say anything to prove that Stephen was the one that did this. Stephen was having the affair with her. Stephen was the one intimate with her. Oh, and by the way, he's violent. He has guns and knives. And officers were taking everything he was saying, writing it down, but taking it very much with a grain of salt, because why is Robert all of a sudden kind of like pointing all fingers at Stephen? He went from stating he didn't know Latrice to now pointing fingers at Stephen for her murder, and then told police that when he had got home from his girlfriend's house that night, which was around 1:30 a.m., he stated that he noticed that Robert's vehicle nor Robert were at home. So officers then compared Stephen's story to the alarm code log, and sure enough, Stephen entered his personal code that night at 1:30 a.m. when he returned back home. So their codes for the alarm are different. Robert has his own and Stephen has his own. So when checking the alarm log, this led officers to discover that the alarm went off and the code was entered again at 2:30 a.m. But this time, the master code, which was Robert's code, was entered to deactivate the alarm system. After Stephen's interrogation, Stephen willingly submitted DNA. He allowed police to photograph him, which is typically done, because of cuts, bruises, scars that police may not notice right then and there, but want to have pictures, photographs of this to look back on. He willingly, submitted DNA. He willingly took photographs. And so as far as they knew, Stephen was cooperating. So from the crime scene on the highway and from Latrice's vehicle, officers were able to collect a significant amount of blood and DNA. The DNA found within the blood collected at the scene showed to be a mixture of two different people, and they were able to indicate that one of that person was definitely Latrice herself. So now having Stephen and Darren's DNA, officers ran Stephen and Darren's DNA against the DNA blood that was found in Latrice's car, and at the crime scene, officers were able to rule both of them out. Neither of their DNA matched the DNA found at the crime scene. So this left officers to run one more person's DNA that they investigated. And this person was indeed Robert Reeves. So once they ran Robert's DNA, it came back as a match to the DNA found at the crime scene. So on February 2nd, 2008, Reeves was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Latrice. I'm sure you guys can just imagine how in shock the community was when they found out that Robert, the minister, this local influential pastor, has been arrested in connection to the death of Latrice. I think another reason why the community was kind of in shock was because they didn't even know how Latrice and Robert knew each other. Latrice was a young, beautiful college student, a newlywed, and Robert was a minister. Latrice didn't even attend Robert's church. So the community was just really extremely confused when this happened. So since the community was confused, and I'm sure you guys probably are as well, I'll just give a little bit more backstory that officials then later released to just connect some dots for you guys. A year prior to Latrice's murder, Stephen met Robert at a mall. This is where they started to, talk, and Stephen told him, I'm a college student and I'm looking for somewhere to live. This is when Robert offered him a place to live. Stephen was, so grateful because he stated that he was a struggling college student, like typically most college students are. He, took him up on that offer, and he moved into the minister's basement at a flat rate of $300 a month. Not too long after moving in, Robert began to make sexual advances to Stephen, in which he was continuously rejected by Stephen. One time, Robert even went as far as offering Stephen free rent in exchange for oral sex. A few months after moving in, Stephen's girlfriend stated that she had been receiving really weird and strange phone calls from an unknown number. And she would answer, and when she would answer, it'd be a man on the phone constantly threatening her. This man was not only threatening Stephen's girlfriend, but he was saying threats to Stephen as well. He would say things like, "I'll break Stephen's leg so that he'll no longer be able to play basketball and his basketball career would be over." So Stephen also stated that he himself received numerous calls from a blocked number as well. And when he would answer the phone, it'd be an angry man on the other line, not making direct threats, but like asking Stephen, "Make sure you have a gun." And coincidentally enough, after this phone call from a strange man specifically stating that he had hoped Stephen had a gun, when Stephen got home and looked under his mattress, his gun was gone. And right then and there, Stephen automatically knew that Robert was not only the one that took his gun, but he was most likely the one making those phone calls to him and his girlfriend. A few days after Stephen and his girlfriend had been receiving those phone calls, while Stephen was visiting his girlfriend one night, he had discovered that all 4 of his tires had been slashed. And since it was super late, Stephen just decided to stay the night at his girlfriend's house and figure everything out. Earlier in the story, I stated that Robert let Stephen drive his car because his tires were slashed. Well, this is the incident where Stephen's car was parked at his girlfriend's house. He walks out one day and all 4 of his tires were slashed. So basically, Stephen says, "You know what? I'll just deal with it in the morning and just stay the night at my girlfriend's house." So Robert then calls Stephen and goes, "No, it's okay. Just come home. I'll tow your car here and you'll be fine. You don't have to stay the night at her house. Just come home." And Stephen thought this was super strange that Robert was trying to pressure him into coming home that night. Stephen was like, "It's okay. I already said I'll figure it out tomorrow. I'll get it towed tomorrow. It's too late. It's fine." So Stephen just, did what he said he was going to do. He stayed the night at his girlfriend's house. And then the following morning, Robert had helped Stephen tow the car back to his house and then said, "Here are my car keys. Here's the spare. If you ever need to drive it, it's all yours." So after investigators continued to dig a little bit further, they found out that Robert had 2 phone lines registered to his name. And basically, officers, what they did was confirm that these weird and strange phone calls that was made to Stephen and his girlfriend were indeed from one of Robert's phone lines. Police then concluded that Robert Reeves was just completely obsessed with Stephen from all of this information. They think that his obsession with Stephen just got completely out of hand. And basically, Stephen continuously denying Robert's sexual advances just turned into a jealous rage. It is extremely unfortunate that Robert took this jealous rage out on Latrice, who had nothing to do with the situation. Officers concluded and kind of sort of figured out that on the night of January 29th, after Stephen left the house to go to his girlfriend's house, Reeves then got in his vehicle and followed Latrice on her way home, somehow got her to pull over, killed her, and left her body on the side of the road not too far from her vehicle. Like I said before, the entire community was just shocked and in complete disbelief, and some even going as far as stating that this had nothing to do with Robert. Robert would never do something like this, and Robert was indeed set up. Basically, Robert was living 2 completely different lives that no one had no idea about. It was hard for everyone in the community and the church to basically believe, that Robert had lived 2 different lives. Officers not only put Robert at the scene of the crime, they matched up his DNA, and they also, I guess you want to say, kind of found a motive. His motive was extremely weird because he took out his anger on the wrong person. First of all, he had no reason to be angry. He was mad because Stephen was denying his sexual advances, which was even strange to begin with. But it's interesting because what a lot of people in the community didn't know is that Robert had a lengthy criminal background. In fact, in 1987, he had been charged in relation to committing sexual conduct with a young boy. And the following year, in 1988, he was arrested again for third-degree sex charges in which he served time in prison for. So I'm sure nobody in the community thought that their minister, Robert Reeves, literally completely lived a double life. I'm pretty sure no one even knew that he had served time in prison for sexual acts against a minor and a minor boy. So a little bit over a year after Latrice was murdered, in September of 2009, Robert Reeves was on trial for the murder of Latrese Curtis. During this trial, the prosecution was able to show an overwhelmingly amount of physical and circumstantial evidence. Stephen testified, going into great detail of the sexual advances that Robert had made towards him. In addition, the prosecutor brought up Robert's criminal history involving sexual advances towards young boys, and the defense, as they always do, tried to place blame on someone else, which is exactly what they did. They pointed all the fingers at Stephen and said he's the one that had motive to kill Latrice. You know, Latrice called him that night to say that she wants to take things further. He was the one that was having an affair with Latrice. He was the one that actually had a girlfriend as well. And, you know, typical claims that the defense would make in this case. During trial, the defense also stated that Robert had a non-working left hand and arm due to him being stabbed a few years prior, which would make him incapable of stabbing Latrice to death. The defense stated, and I quote, "Who's the better candidate, a young basketball player and an NBA hopeful, or Robert Reeves with a useless left hand and arm?" End quote. Another interesting thing I noted was that the defense were never able to explain why Robert Reeves's car was at the crime scene that night. It is just, you know, great. And like I said earlier, this was the huge break in the case they needed. But that state trooper driving past that night, knowing that something was suspicious, and him just typing in the license plate number and then bringing that up to them, ultimately even led them to Robert Reeves. Despite the defense's efforts to create some type of reasonable doubt in the jurors' mind, and they did not succeed and completely failed at, Robert Reeves was charged with the first-degree murder of Latrese Curtis and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So this story was just really interesting to me. Everyone would assume that Stephen was the one that, you know, killed Latrice because of reasons that I previously stated, but it was really Robert, because he was probably jealous that Latrice was even sleeping with Stephen, and Robert wanted to be the one, you know, doing that. That just sounds just completely crazy. And just the fact that like he killed a woman that was like sleeping with a man that was denying his own sexual advances is just, I don't know another word besides crazy to put to it. Nothing that Latrice did, like absolutely nothing that she did, warranted her being murdered. Yes, Latrice did have an affair, but that did not warrant her to be murdered. And not only was Latrice brutally murdered for no reason at all, it was by someone who completely not only fooled her into thinking he was holier thou in this minister, but by the entire community and by his entire congregation. Latrese Curtis was a 21-year-old college student. She was a wife, she was a daughter, she was a friend, and she deserved to live out her dreams, just like we all do. So that is pretty much all I have for you guys today. Please leave some comments down below as to you guys' opinion, or what you guys think about this case. I mean, I can't even begin to like wrap my mind around what this man was thinking. Like, it just is extremely sad. So like I said, let's keep the conversation going down below in the comments. I'll also leave some links in regards to Latrese Curtis if you guys would like to do some more research about her case as well. Also, please do not forget to subscribe if you guys have not subscribed already. I'd really appreciate it. Until next Wednesday's true crime video, I hope you all stay safe out there.